Welcome back to If I Knew You Better. I'm Brendan Davis, your host, and this week's guest is Greg Loftin. Greg is a screenwriter and filmmaker, also a professor and a recent PhD. He is the head of a university post-production program. He has years of professional experience in both writing, filmmaking, and post. He has combined all this background into his new book called Writing for the Cut. It is from Michael Wiese Productions. Now, you may notice a theme or two emerging with my guests lately. I'm really focusing this show on entertainment folks and not on celebrities, but on highlighting the arts and crafts people, the people who work day to day in the wider industry kind of around the world. And so I'm going to talk to people like I have been, ranging from long working character actors to writers, directors, and producers, as well as the coaches, agents, and teachers who help all those other people to be their best. Some of my upcoming guests include TV showrunners, which is a term you know if you are in the business, and if not, those are the writer-producers who are in charge of and run a TV show, as well as talent agents and managers. I've got some top film technicians who work on set, as well as people in post-production who are lined up, and a lot more. I'm also going to keep featuring authors who have a unique perspective on all the above. But regardless of whoever I'm interviewing, my goal is that I want to do my best to bring to life the sometimes very esoteric jobs that make the stories that we all enjoy on screen possible, but in ways that are fun for everybody to listen to. So you don't have to have a lot of inside baseball knowledge, but you will learn a lot of things along the way that hopefully make looking at the credits, when you occasionally look at the credits on a film or TV show, that will just make that come to life even more. Now, I don't want to regurgitate information that you can hear anywhere else. Today's interview with Greg is no exception. I'm really glad that we got to highlight his unique take on screenwriting. His idea marries approaching that craft with how it ultimately leads to the finished cut. Now, other people have touched on this area in other ways, of course, but Greg's approach is something I've never heard so well stated and thought out before. He did a level of research on this that earned him that PhD I mentioned previously, so it is worth a serious listen to what he has to say, especially if either of these crafts is something that appeals to you. But there's a lot to learn about storytelling in general. Plus, he's a very funny guy, and so I think it's just an enjoyable chat. Now, one show note is that next week features an interview with Michael Wiese himself, the filmmaker and publisher behind Greg's book and hundreds more, including dozens of books that are either classics or reference books in film programs around the world. Michael's spiritually driven journey led him around the world and then some, so I'm really excited for you to hear what he had to say. But I don't want to get ahead of myself because I'm also excited for you to hear this week's show. So without further ado, please enjoy my interview with Greg Loftin. Greg Loftin, nice to meet you.
Hi there, Brendan. Yeah, how you doing?
I'm very well, and actually, technically, it's Dr. Loftin, if I am not mistaken, yes?
Yeah, not that kind of doctor, but yeah, it's true. I did a PhD fairly recently, which was a real odyssey. I'll talk a little about that later, probably.
I'm sure we will get into that. And for my friends who completed such a journey, I just wanted to give a tip of the hat because I know it is no joke, and I know it's recent enough that you. I'd like to throw a little respect your way right up top, if I could.
Hey, thanks so much.
No worries.
Absolutely thrilling and really transformative in so many ways for me. So it was, I'm the guy to talk to if you want to know about PhDs.
Awesome. Well, I may do that offline. To get started, I have a question that I like to start with in general, which is, how do you introduce yourself to people who you would like to know better?
In life?
Yes.
So if I'm at a party, I guess the way that I would generally do it is to find out about them. I suppose the most tedious people I ever meet are the ones that will walk up to you and talk a storm, really talk about themselves and look for you just to nod and to make approving noises, and then go away, and they found out nothing about you. So I suppose, it's not really a strategy. It's just, I guess I'm interested in people. So sure. I guess I want to find out how what goes on with people, what they're doing, and you automatically look for connections. I suppose I generally beat a path, towards the things that I love and have passion for. So in almost no time at all, I'm asking what films I saw recently. So I guess that's a big one.
Awesome. Well, and I love that response. And in the spirit of that, Greg, I'm asking you, please tell me a little bit about yourself. Who are you and what do you do? And, if I already knew you better, what would I know you for?
I'd love it if you knew me for the one feature film that I made, which was a tiny Brit flick feature film. It's a black comedy, a kind of Western set on a housing estate called Saxon.
Okay.
And I made this, I wrote it, I directed it, and I edited it. And it's just one of the biggest stories I've ever put together. And, it's very much a low budget feature, and it was made with, the love and financial assistance of lots of friends, and a second mortgage, which
time honored
really
tradition.
Really don't try this at home. This is don't do it. The second mortgage thing is forget about it.
Yeah.
Having said that, I could almost not resist. This was such a, sometimes when you write a screenplay, it gets to a kind of critical mass. There's a kind of, there's traction behind it. You can see it, you can taste it. It's there. It dances tantalizingly in front of your eyes. And you have to realize you have to make it.
Yeah.
And you have to find a way of doing it. And it was, in many respects, I mean, it's been a terrific journey for me because the film did well. It was certainly, featured at a number of festivals. It was shortlisted for the Michael Powell Award at the Edinburgh Film Festival.
Wow.
It won Best Drama at the European Film Festival. And it got some, critical attention for sure. But it never kind of broke through and was released mainstream cinemas. We certainly had a distributor, and you can certainly, stream it online. But the big thing for me, I suppose, is how much it taught me about the relationship between the word and the image, which is kind of, front and center of the book that we'll come on to talk about later on. So that one of the ways in which if it isn't the first thing I talk about when I meet, a stranger, it'll probably come up at some point.
Sure.
But my day job is I'm a course leader for an undergraduate program called Editing and Post-Production at Ravensbourne University, London. And I've been running in various guises edit and post courses for quite some time. And because I'm a storyteller, I just love this alchemical craft we call film editing. And I edit, still, I take on commissions. So I'm always immersed in this craft. So I'm looking at students' cuts, all the time. I get, for a living to immerse myself in a thing that I really have a passion for. So I love this job that I do. And I love it that it gives me also time in the week to pursue my own projects.
Well, this is something that with obviously the details being different, this is something that we have in common. It's part of why when the opportunity to talk to you came my way and I read your book, I felt like you wrote it for me. And,
right.
Being that that's my background, people who've listened to different of my shows would know this, but if this is the first time somebody's hearing it, I won't belabor the point, but basically I'm a filmmaker who has been an editor professionally for, 20 odd years myself. And I really related to the method that you use to explain screenwriting and especially in a way to make it compelling. There are a lot of great writing manuals out there. Recently, I've been lucky to read several that have a fresh take on that as a genre, but yours is the first one that really highlighted the correlation between the page and the screen. So I'm curious how you came to this, let's maybe start a little further back. I wanted to name check what you're doing for the sake of letting people know where we're going. What do you consider to be your roots? I mean, where you came from and how you sort of developed, pre-Saxon and pre-editing wizardry.
Wow. Okay. Where to begin with that? I suppose, just to keep it relatively focused, let's start around my degree. So I did an undergraduate degree in theatre and TV studies, and then went on to do an MA in film. And at that point, I teamed up with a fellow student, and we formed a video production company. Mm-hmm. And we made all kinds of videos mostly for corporate clients, and for public sector organizations, and for Channel 4. Mm-hmm. And I guess one of the great things about running a relatively small enterprise like that is you get to do quite a lot of different crafts.
Yeah, because you have to.
Yeah. So you're running a business, and you're also the director, and sometimes you're writing a script, and sometimes you're editing, and you're working with a partner who's also multi-talented. And you're living by your wits, and you're looking for the next client. And sometimes it's fairly fast turnaround and quite pressured. Mm-hmm. And it's a very, it's quite a dynamic stew of things. And so the partnership, the video partnership, ran for quite a few years. And then, in the background, I was always writing, like probably most of your listeners, you're always writing a screenplay. You've always got a screenplay on. Mm-hmm. And, some of them will never have the lungs and legs to get up and dance and turn cartwheels, which is what they've got to do if you want to make it.
Yeah.
But I wrote this screenplay, Saxon, and over quite a long period of time. And it probably took me, obviously when you're working very full time, you can only dedicate a relatively little time to developing the script over time. But nevertheless, it took about 4 or 5 years, which is a long time to be, fooling around with one story.
Yeah.
And I always, in the back of my head, I always thought there's got to be a faster way of doing this. Really? 5, 6 years working on your own.
If you figure it out, let me know. That describes the thing that I'm writing myself right now, that I'm rewriting for the Xth time.
Yeah, that's right. And then there is something built into the process of screenwriting that just tends towards what I call slow failure. And I nevertheless, through that process, I did come up with what I thought was, this great screenplay. Mm-hmm. I convinced myself enough that it was a great screenplay, then to go out and make it. And isn't it fabulous that we live in a time when technology, and the accessibility to relatively inexpensive but high quality cameras and post-production facilities and grading software and the whole technical panoply can be relatively inexpensive. And we as storytellers, screenwriters, many of us can do this thing. And so, for whatever it was, like £100,000 back then. So this is maybe over 10 years ago.
Okay.
We made a full-length feature film with starring a guy who you might not know his name straight away, but I suspect you might recognize his face. He's been in many, many feature films. A guy called Sean Harris.
Yeah, no, I know who he is actually, but yes, people would recognize him.
Yeah, for sure. He plays villains. I mean, he nearly always plays villains, and in my film he's kind of a villain, but he's a kind of villain, a troubled soul that kind of comes good, and
sort of an anti-hero-ish guy.
Yeah, an anti-hero guy. I mean, he was really pleased to get the role in a sense because he loved it and felt in a sense that it kind of resonated with his own life,
Right.
Disturbingly. And, he loved it that he ran off with the leading lady in the end. He said for the kind of films he ends up with, he usually gets to kill the women. He rarely gets to kiss them.
Oh, no. I'm glad it worked out this time.
Yeah. So after making that film and then, going off to festivals and getting some acclaim, and getting that kind of real sense of, wow, this could be the beginning of something.
Yeah.
I've really not managed to shake off this filmmaking bug. It's something that looms large in my life.
Sure.
I suppose this is partly what propelled me into writing, commencing this PhD, because what I was thinking is that, writing a screenplay, getting it financed and made is just like winning the lottery. I mean, even if you're a really good screenwriter, the odds of turning your screenplay into a commercial product is very rare. Mm-hmm. So I decided, having already written a few screenplays in my life, and most of them ending up metaphorically collecting dust, decided that, well, if I do a PhD, there are a few really good potential outcomes from this. One would be that you will have, for the duration of that PhD, a great mentor. So for me, the search was on to find a supervisor, a PhD supervisor, who had the right kind of profile and skill set to help nurture me and the screenplay. So it was a PhD by practice, and the practical component was a screenplay, and then the written component, the critical thinking component, was some kind of, in prospect, a piece of writing, like 20, 30,000 words, that was an original contribution in some sense to knowledge, right. But related to the screenplay. In other words, the screenplay would be in some measure an illustration of a train of thought.
Right. Yeah. The principles delineated in the written component are evident in the script.
Yeah. That's it. Yeah. Yeah. So that was the beginning of my journey into the PhD, and I did it pretty much full time for 4 years, and it was a fantastic learning journey. And the nature of a PhD by practice is that, you have these regular touch points with your supervisor, but for the most part, you're driving this thing yourself. So, I'm writing a screenplay. I'm getting, really quality feedback from his name's Sam North. He's a professor at Exeter University. So we would have these, these really dynamic, white knuckle conversations, every sort of 2 or 3 weeks, where we'd be talking about story and getting really kind of excited and lit up and angry, and it was just great stuff. And I had that ongoing dialogue, developing the script and the written component, which became my final thesis, called Writing for the Cut. We developed that over 4 years.
And so that book, that has become your book, which is what I was referencing, what we were referencing, and what I have now read from Michael Wiese Productions. So as you were writing it as your dissertation, I imagine, were you aware that this was becoming a book, or had the potential to be a book that you would try to get published?
Yes. So just going back to my earlier thought about the PhD and how I could use it in a really practical way, I thought the outputs from that could be a good screenplay, that I could trade, and that's had lots of tender loving care, a book, that I could publish, and it was less obvious to me when I began the PhD, but as I started to write the PhD, a third output, which would be the development of a piece of software for screenwriters.
Yes. Let's talk about that.
Yeah.
Yeah. This is something interesting. It's sort of a footnote at the end of your, it's a postscript in your book. And that caught my eye especially. So please, tell us a bit about that.
Yeah. So, writing for the cut, I'll just, as a thumbnail, say that, the book is devoted to answering this simple question, which is, what can screenwriters learn from film editors about storytelling? And it turns out quite a lot.
Right. Right.
And I know this now because I'm on the other end of the journey where I've, had the opportunity to talk to just some of the best feature film editors and to learn a little about their secret craft.
You have those interviews in your book with the likes of Walter Murch and such are fantastic.
Yeah. It's been, this book in a way, stands on the shoulder of giants, and the contribution of the film editors is really absolutely at the heart of this thing. So I'm passing, as it were, back down the line from the edit suite to the screenwriter. The tricks of the trade, the thoughts, the poetry of the cut, so that screenwriters can come to understand, and deploy a range of different strategies in their screenwriting that are for the cut, that are absolutely about the real physics of screen storytelling. And this is not necessarily a novel idea. This is actually how great screenwriters write anyway.
Right. But it's not taught. It's not taught quite that clearly, though, I must say.
No, I don't think it is. I'll come to that in a moment because I'll just finish off on the software thing, because what then happens with the software is that, if we can start to employ some of those editing strategies, we can understand a little bit about the grammar of the cut. Can we start to steal some of the tools that editors use to tell their stories, so that screenwriters can write their story in words the way that editors cut their stories with images and sounds. And that's a big project for me now.
Well, how is that manifesting for you? Are you actually currently in development on the software itself, or are you gathering are you doing your research about what's needed? Kind of, where are you with that process? Yeah,
so I'm fortunate in that my university has invested some research funding in this, and it's allowed me to conduct some surveys where I have surveyed around 100 or so screenwriters, just around, what kind of software do you use? How do you tell stories? Do you ever use images? What stimulates your story? How do you, as it were, rehearse your story? Do you ever try, rehearsed readings? Do you use cue cards? What does it use? And then developing on from that, I've created, in the first instance, a kind of mock-up of a mock-up, where then I shared this with a smaller pool of screenwriters to get some more in-depth quality feedback, and I'm now at the point where I've commissioned a motion graphics artist to develop an animated walkthrough of the software. So this is a really exciting time because I'm really thinking about, menus and features and buttons and interfaces.
Wow. So you're deep in it right now.
Yeah. And what it is, and as again, the initial idea came out of the PhD, is creating a hybrid cloud editing app that works something like film editor interface, mixed with Final Draft, mixed with Prezi, and something that has a time value and works with proxy images, proxy sounds, and text. Also incorporates the idea of mood board and animation. Even if it sounds kind of complicated as I describe it, people who have seen the mock-up, describe it as something like, oh wow, yeah, okay, I can see myself entering this space, and I can see how I can start to play with the parts of my story. To rapid prototype my story to arrive at something more concrete, perhaps more rapidly.
Mm-hmm. And is the idea that this is for sort of more for like story and creation purposes, and then you would still write the script in traditional software like Final Draft, or would there be a way to do all the creation work within this interface, and then you could output the more standard, document that we're going to budget and schedule, basically, but that you would do all of the work in this interface?
Yes. So this is, why it's been great having a conversation with practicing screenwriters, because, they're telling me about features that they'd quite like. In an earlier draft, in an earlier version of the software, the journey, in a sense, or the creativity finished, at a treatment phase, and then you exported to, Final Draft or something of that sort. Mm-hmm. But I think that the preference seems to be amongst the people I'm having a dialogue with to have everything under one roof. So let me give you an idea. How can I maybe paint it in words a little bit?
Please.
Yeah. So the idea about writing for the cut as a concept is really that film is made of fragments, and it's important to think in fragments. A bit like fridge magnet poetry is one of the ways in which I think about it. Fridge magnet poetry, in a way, is the link, I think, between the word and the image, because it is predisposed towards poetry. It is predisposed towards engaging the reader in joining the dots, in creating meaning from what they're seeing. So without laboring this too much at this point, but the bridge between the written word and the moving image is poetry. And one of the ways you get to this kind of screen poetry is through fragment and fragmentation, because through fragment you create juxtaposition, and juxtaposition is the DNA of cinema. You collide this image with this image and sound, and you create a third meaning that explodes and blossoms in the mind of the viewer.
Right.
And this central dynamic is what propels all great screenwriting projects and all great films. Mm-hmm. And we're hardly aware of it because we are so kind of screen literate. It's almost a subliminal process for us. But as we watch any good film, we are infilling, we are adding, we are contributing, we are story contributors, to the end product. And is that kind of wide awake contribution that the audience gives to the film that that most entertain us. This is what keeps us in the zone and keeps us excited. This is what creates traction. Mm-hmm. So with that in mind, the software gets you to think about moving your story towards the screen almost immediately, which is to say, write it, express it in images and sounds and text. Mm-hmm. So this is about sourcing proxy images and sounds, but particularly images, still images and moving images, clips if you want it, and throwing it into an interface, a working space that is somewhat like an editor's, where you have a timeline, and you can create your story beats, you can write text, you can juxtapose, you can play around with these image and sound and text fragments fairly rapidly, so that you're in the business of what it is that editors do, which is, play, review, edit, replay, review, edit, replay. And so you are watching this thing in real time. So you are actually, for the first time, watching your story as something on the screen, as opposed to what we are used to, which is working in effectively word processing software.
Right. Right. And the movie is playing in your head, but it's not in front of your eyeballs.
That's right. Yeah. There is this thing, I guess I think about quite a lot, which is of screenwriting being a really kind of solo occupation,
right.
Sometimes an addiction for sure. But this thing of working on your own in on what is effectively a typewriter, we don't think like typewriters. We kind of get used to this thing. And the real physics of a screen story, composed of fragment and light and sound and juxtaposition and, and movement, motion and emotion is something that you have to keep in front of, before you at all times, or you'll end up writing, I don't know, for radio, or you might be writing literature, but you might not be writing. And the problem with screenwriting software is that there's no kind of red flashing warning button on the software saying, this is not for cinema. It's crap. Start again. This is not something you can film. This is not something that can be acted out. This is not something that can be directed or visually realized. Forget about it. You need to be. So it seems to me that a piece of software that constantly keeps you in the world of images and sounds and music and text, for sure, because text, you've got to have dialogue and you've got to write the story beats. But nevertheless, the text to a degree plays second fiddle to the primacy of the image and the sound, it seems to me.
I think that's obviously this was a fundamental insight. It's not something new that you just discovered, because this underpins your approach to this work, but it's something that I also first intuited and have now since learned in between reading interviews or some of a few of the name brand screenwriters who I've been lucky to chat with or get to know a little bit have confirmed, or I've read it and other things. But, this is something that most of the best, especially if you're working, I mean, if it's a stately costume drama that moves at a glacial pace, then that's perhaps not as exciting to read. But people who are writing an action or thriller or comedy genres, they're writing to where the script itself you have an experience of the action when you read it. If it's funny, you don't just laugh, oh, there's the joke and that's a funny joke. You're laughing at the way the writer is talking to you in the action description. And whether it's, Shane Black's first $1 million sale when he was a student, or the way Terry Rossio and Ted Elliott have written their screenplays for Shrek and Pirates, or the way Tarantino writes. I mean, the experience of reading it just absolutely leaps off the page. And it's so funny because one of the first times I was struck by this of an older script was when I read The Princess Bride by William Goldman, who's one of the gold standards for a lot of people. And I was so moved because it spoke to me, the reader. It wasn't taking this objective God point of view and sort of laying it out very dispassionately. It was actually telling me this story. And there's a quote so I've had this actually on my phone where I could see it every day that I'm going to share, that you may have heard this, but I've had this on my phone now for the better part of a year since I heard it. Aaron Sorkin is one of my favorite writers. Speaking of someone who puts this into practice, although he's known for his text and his dialogue, his screenplays really move. And he was on Mark Maron's podcast, and Maron asked him, because Bill Goldman was a huge mentor of his, Maron asked Aaron Sorkin, what is the best piece of writing advice that you got from your mentor, William Goldman? And Sorkin said that in the quote I have, write the experience you want the reader to have. Write the experience you want the reader to have. And I thought, Yeah, that's exactly what he does at his best. That's what all these people I just dropped in my word salad, that's what they do at their best. And to me, that's what, again, I'm reading your book, realizing, oh, this is driving toward that. And more importantly, it's starting with helping the writer have that experience and having a way to articulate the experience and not just here are the words and the thoughts that you have to connect all the dots. Let me actually put it in a way that is experientially obvious to you, and that is not something that you have to extrapolate from my philosophy.
Yeah.
How did you have that revelation? How did you come to that yourself? Was it a result of these things and working and editing, and did you have a eureka moment, basically, is what I'm trying to get to?
Yeah. Yes. I had several eureka moments, and like the best eureka moments, in a way, what's happening is that it's finding, I suppose, other voices that seem to be saying the same thing, so you stumble across someone who seems to be saying the same thing as you. So you mentioned Tarantino earlier on, and, he has this quite famous quote, which really, I think nails it, which is that the first draft of the screenplay is the first cut of the movie.
Yes.
And the final cut of the movie is the last draft of the script. And, people like Tarantino and particularly David Mamet, who writes about, the cut, he says, let the cut tell the story. These people, really understand the physics, if you like, of screen storytelling. Mm-hmm. So Sorkin, who talks about, write the way that you want the viewer to experience the film, mm-hmm. is a bit like, I suppose, also about a bit like Sid Field saying, write in images and sounds, mm-hmm. And this is great advice, but no one tells you how.
Right. Right.
And we all think we know how because we see so many films, but we really don't. And the curious thing is that this is one of the things that became apparent to me when I started to research. So I must have read most of the, certainly the guru manuals that have been written for screenwriters. That there is this studious avoidance in all of the manuals to ever talk about production processes, right, let alone post-production processes, because of this injunction.
Yeah, don't direct from the page. Yeah,
direct from the page. Yeah, don't do this thing. It's against the law, and so this injunction has tended to screen off and to, I guess it's created a kind of vacuum, for the screenwriter around really how you get from the word to the moving image.
Right,
and if we don't think about, in my book, I talk about the instruments that play our music. If we don't know about those instruments, about cameras and about editing and about mise en scène, if we don't really understand the dynamic of how those instruments are playing our song, playing our music, then we are just writing probably for a notion of cinema rather than a real understanding of cinema.
Right. That actually leads me to something what is something, and this can be specific in your case. Sometimes I ask people this just as a general open-ended question, but I think this could probably apply very specifically to your work. What is something that to be true in your gut, but that has not been widely proven publicly yet?
In relation to feature films, or
in relation to
anything?
In relation to anything, but I guess I'm specifically in the process of this, you could take that wider if you want to talk about, how people experience films, or I mean, you can answer that in whichever way is maybe the most interesting for you. But what's something you think about, whether it's specific to the writing process or about cinema, or it can even be philosophical about life that applies to all of this, but something that you really feel that is true, but it's not something that is kind of conventional wisdom.
That's one that's worth a ponder, and I don't think anyone listening to this would want to be listening to me quietly pondering.
Well, I could cut out the pause, don't forget.
Great radio. But I would say that the biggest spark for me, and it was a kind of an epiphany, was when I was studying film. The thing that lit me up, and I thought, wow, this is really at the heart of everything to do with film, was discovering Kuleshov.
Mm-hmm.
And people don't really talk so much about Kuleshov these days, but Lev Kuleshov, and I'm certain that most of your listeners will know about him, but I'm going to just give you a little thumbnail.
It's a diverse, it's not all just filmmakers. So please explain a bit about the Kuleshov effect.
Yeah. So Lev Kuleshov gives his name to an effect, the Kuleshov effect. He was a filmmaker and head of the School of Film in Moscow during Soviet era times back in the 1920s. And he, like many of his filmmaking peers, Eisenstein and Pudovkin and Dziga Vertov and so on, were absolutely in a kind of ecstasy around this new medium of film, which had really only broken into the world, like 20 years earlier, and was a new thing that no one really understood entirely the properties of, and they were experimenting with this medium, young, really ideas-driven young people with, in a kind of fever. And Kuleshov, particularly in his role as a mentor, as a teacher, he ran an experiment to determine the power of the cut, of juxtaposition. And this became known as the Kuleshov Effect. And in a nutshell, it works like this. He filmed an actor in a kind of mid-shot, looking off camera left or camera right, I forget what. And he cut this shot with another shot of a bowl of hot soup. And then he showed this to his students, and they could see in the look of the eye of the actor that he was really hungry for that soup. What great acting. And then they cut the same shot of the actor, the same footage of that actor looking off at something else. And this case, it was a point of view shot now of a coffin. And then, so it would be like reverse shot. So
right.
Looking, there's the object, reverse back to the actor. And now the actor, the same footage, mind you, is imbued with this sense of grief. And then the third one was, I think, a small child, or it was, it was something that he was looking at lovingly, like a beautiful lady. Exactly. And it was the same shot of him looking right down the barrel. It was the same shot. And so, So this is like, you could look at it, mechanically as like, it's an uninflected shot, a point of view, and then it comes back to the same shot, and now it is inflected with the thing that you cut away to. Mm-hmm. And what was the revelation for Kuleshov and everyone who follows afterwards was this idea that, that no image has an absolute meaning, but changes sometimes quite radically through the collision of a juxtaposition. And this is this is front and center. It is the DNA of all feature films, all screen stories. Mm-hmm. And if you can find mechanisms for keeping that kind of electricity in your writing, then you are writing for the screen.
How do you go about doing that in practice? I mean, how do you actually make that your reality when you're working?
So the great thing about the PhD journey was that I was constantly engaged in developing screenplay, which I wanted to be a commercial screenplay. I didn't want it to be an illustration of a theory. I wanted it to really stand up. I wanted the theory really to turbocharge this feature film script, to make it truly as close to the screen as possible. It's like so that it was jumping to the rhythm of the cut. And so I was experimenting and with tricks of the trade that have been passed down to me, and I've kind of created thumbnails for the different strategies. One of the things that I do is that I having determined that juxtaposition is at the heart of screen storytelling, I then break this down and say, well, look, do all juxtapositions work in the same way? And are there different kind of juxtapositions that are working on our emotions or our intellect or our heart in different ways? And I break this down into three kinds of juxtaposition. All of them are work in the way of poetry, if you like, in the sense that they draw upon the viewer to complete, what it is that they're seeing. Basically, it's the Kuleshov Effect.
Right.
And the three sort of categories of juxtaposition I come down to are suggestion, puzzle, and kinesis. So with suggestion, this is a kind of juxtaposition that invites the audience to add imagination and subtext, and the kind of strategies that shake out of that are split scene break and nonlinear shuffle. So without going into details here in the book, I expand on these strategies. Other ones for puzzle would include ellipsis in medias res, start in the middle of things, script and montage, and opening sequences, title sequences, and finally in kinesis I have a series of strategies: parallel action scene, suspense, and dialogue. So that these juxtapositions, work in, I want to say, different categories of juxtapositions. In fact, they all work generally collectively at different moments. It's just that some of these some types of juxtapositions kind of lead, and the other ones are more passive.
Well, I think that you also reference earlier in your book, I believe it's one of your homework assignments fairly early, maybe even chapter 1, if I'm not mistaken, that you recommend that people watch a film that actually I used to know Wendy Apple back in LA, who she directed this film about film editing.
Yeah, the magic of movie editing. Yeah.
Right. And it is available, although I don't even know if there is a link where you could purchase it, but it has been on YouTube for free for so long now. And, the magic of film editing. Yeah. What is that actually the name of the film? I'm blanking. I have it on my computer. I feel embarrassed because I brought it up, but it is absolutely it illustrates these things. So even if someone is not an editor, and it illustrates this in a way that makes it really visually clear for people. The cutting edge, the magic of movie editing. That's it. Yes, I had to dig it up. The cutting edge. And so again, last I checked, it was still available freely on YouTube. So I don't think they have a video distribution deal that's taking anything away from Wendy's estate, but that's a great.
You almost get a sense. Yeah, you almost get the sense with that documentary that it was always a kind of public service somehow. I mean, in the sense of, the contribution that people made to this. It's hard, I think, for people who don't really know so much about editing. It's hard when they watch a documentary like Magic Movie Editing for them to appreciate just how much is being revealed that has never been revealed before about this occult, craft. Because the fact is that we tend to talk about film editors as humble backroom folk, but it's actually their professional status that makes them so. They cannot, in a way, say too much about what goes on in the cutting, because feature films are commercially sensitive assets, and no editor can be saying, "Wow, you should see how I saved that film."
It was such a disaster, and then yeah,
totally, and many film editors will hardly, put their hand up to declaring that they're storytellers, because surely that's that's the screenwriter or the director, has lays claim to the title of storyteller. But the fact is, the editor really is the final storyteller. Yeah. Of course, the editor is telling the story in dialogue with the director. But the fact is, it is the editor's, heightened sense of structure, of really the DNA of how screen stories work. And this is, it becomes almost something that is really sublime, for an editor. They don't even consciously need to think about what's working. It becomes almost like a kind of jazz that they have absorbed, and through watching and cutting so many movies, the real pulse of what a film should look like. When they're cutting a film, it's that they are constantly testing the cinema worthiness of that sequence, that cut. Right. And they can only do that, can only know that through just many years of spending time in a dark room, and through creating, an endless kind of graveyard of the cuts that didn't work. Sure. That, when we watch a film, we can hardly be aware that for every moment of the cut, there are potentially 10, 15 graveyards around it where the cut didn't work. Mm-hmm. And so it's this iterative process, that they're engaged in, where they are, testing against their memory of what is cinema worthy.
What is something that, I relate to that, and I could tangent off and discuss that for just an hour with you. So for the sake of this being a little bit tighter show than that, I'll restrain myself on that impulse. I'll save that for after the interview. But, how do you deal, speaking of, like saving something in the edit? And of course, if it's, which happens more often than people are aware. And I would, of course, never name names, because besides my own experiences where I know this are secondhand from people who, of course, I know it and I'm sworn to secrecy. But there are countless examples of, the director being absent or drunk or otherwise not contributing in the editing room to the degree that you would hope, or on set, or kind of phoning it in, and the DP saving it, the director of photography. Yeah. So what is, how do you deal with those kind of challenges? Like if you were to inherit, as an editor, if you inherit just a pile of footage that's kind of a mess, how do you start? Yeah. And I'm going to take notes here as you drop some wisdom on me.
Well, I think it might strike anyone listening a bit bogus for me to be giving a master class, because I've edited a feature film. It was my feature film. It's the only feature film I've ever edited, to be honest. But I've been around lots of editors, and I've spoken to lots of editors, and I've read lots of books that are by editors. And actually, there's a brilliant book out there, which is Rosenblum, the book, when the shooting stops, the cutting begins. Right.
I'm forgetting the name of the author. Is it Jonathan Rosenberg? Is that who wrote it?
Yeah, I think so.
We'll have to. I'll see if I can fact check this and put it in the show notes.
Sure. And he gives some absolutely extraordinary examples of how, in a way, the cut told a new story completely. So the test case, the big example most people know about this from this book is Annie Hall, right. where Woody Allen fetches up in the edit suite with this extraordinary mound of footage that, for the most part, doesn't connect or work in many ways. Which is partly, the genius of the man that he, and working with Rosenblum. I've probably got his book on my shelf. Sorry, I'm just having a quick look. Yeah, it's Ralph Rosenblum and Robert Caro. I think it's the one we're talking about. It was ultimately down to the editor to find and tell the story. And I don't want to paraphrase what he wrote, but if you look at it, it's such a revelation. I think for me, the idea is that ultimately, we always say this about editors, that the screenplay, of course, matters, and when you got the footage and you first sit down for your first draft, you will want to read the screenplay. I mean, if it's a feature film, you'll have already read it, so you knew what was coming down the pike. And then every editor you ever talk to will say, you read it once, and actually your first cut will be, in a sense, the writer's cut. So you will honor the screenplay by cutting it the way that it was intended by the screenwriter. And likely as not, it'll be a pile of pants. I mean,
that's a very British expression, but I think I understand what that means.
It'll be baggy. It'll be like twice the length it should be. Some things won't quite make sense, and it'll be a hard watch.
Yeah.
And then what happens is most editors will say, "Now forget the script. We're working totally in a different medium now.
Right.
Let's tell the best story we can from the rushes." So this doesn't necessarily mean a radical rethink or restructuring, but it can do, and particularly if there are problems that people had not seen in the screenplay. One of the things I talk about in writing for the cut is how editing is at one and the same time this sublime craft, this magical craft that allows you to do such beautiful things with juxtaposition. And at the same time, it's a lie detector. So what happens is in the cut, it brutally exposes every kind of flaw, acting flaws, directing flaws, lighting flaws, camera flaws. And one of the biggest flaws that it really reveals is the flaw in the structure of the story. And these are things that may not be apparent on the written page, but, are brutally exposed in the edit suite. So, at the level of structure, the order of scenes, is it a linear story, a non-linear story? Could we start, in the middle, and can we jump backwards? This is partly the gift of the editor stroke director, that you can reorder the parts to make it more a screen story rather than keeping faithful with the screenplay.
What is something that you wish you were better at?
Something I wish I was better at. I've always wished I could play the piano as well as my dad.
Yeah. Yeah.
My dad was a professional pianist.
Oh, okay.
And he made a reasonable. I mean, no pianists are paid a terrific amount, but he was he worked all his waking hours supporting a family of. There were 9 of us all together, including mum and dad. So I've got 6 other siblings, and the only way that he could support a tribe like us was by working all his waking hours. And so he was a pianist accompanist for at the Royal Ballet School in London. And then after that, he would go on to his evening lounge jazz gig at the Dorchester or wherever it might be in central London. And then he would go on to his third jazz gig at somewhere like the Latin Quarter, where he would just let his hair down and go crazy.
That's cool.
Over the day, he would go through from, as he would describe it, reading the dots. It could be Chopin or something. Well, that school to playing all the standards. Cocktail jazz and so on. And then at some of the wilder clubs he went to, Ronnie Scott's or whatever, it would be just wild improvised stuff.
That's awesome.
And then he would catch the bus home at 4:00 in the morning, like the earliest bus, and usually fall asleep. And the bus drivers used to know him so well. Sometimes they used to drive the bus to our house. What kind of stuff is that?
That's great. So do you play some? I mean, do you play as an amateur?
Well, yeah. So most of myself and my siblings were given, piano lessons as kids. And, I don't know. I mean, I think I have the patience for it when I was a kid, but, whenever I see a piano, I like to sit down and to make a noise. And I wish sometimes, man, I wish I could do that special thing where you can order the notes and create chords and, even compose something that is transporting.
And of course, there's the analogy between playing an instrument and assembling a film, which is it seems like you have the parallel skill set. That it seems like you.
That's right.
I wonder if the one influenced the other a bit.
Yeah, I think that's probably true, and I would say this of many of the applicants for my edit and post course, that some of them come from music or dance backgrounds, and they cut music videos or they cut montages to music, or they just got a heightened sense of rhythm and pattern, and I think that right at the heart of editing is this heightened sense of rhythm and pattern and movement, and really, there is no formal code for editing in the way that you think of. For music, you have a score, and this symbol means a crotchet or a minim or a semiquaver, and this is a stave, and this is how we can lay it out. For editing, there is nothing like that, and it's very unlikely, editing will ever come down to a formal sort of code language. I think, to describe it in shorthand, and yet you feel as if it's almost something that you could codify in that way. And particularly when you look at an editor's timeline, if you look at an editor's timeline and you expand it out, you can see the shape and the structure as if it were music. It's almost like looking at music expressed somewhat differently on a stave. And I think those connections are really close. Some of the things that I get my students to do, as an exercise, and I think I suggest it in my book as well, is, particularly if you're thinking, if you're interested, and you will be interested in things like, suspense, and what does it, what does a suspense sequence look like? And what does it look like for an editor? Download from YouTube, a clip from, say, one of the examples I give is No Country for Old Men. The Eagle Star hotel sequence, and import that, as it were, flattened sequence into an editing project, and reverse engineer it, add cut where there is a cut.
Yeah, break it out between shots.
Break it backwards down to its component parts, so that ultimately you're going to be looking at that sequence the way that the editor left it. And that can tell you so much about, length of shot, and pattern and repetition and how long to hold things and so on. You can, in a very graphical way, you can learn so much by looking at the editor's cut.
That's a great idea. I remember reading that in your book and thinking that, wow, I've never actually done that. I did that in my alternate career, my previous life as a failed rock star. And so I did that with songwriting, but it never occurred to me to do that with, to understand what it was about certain things that I liked, or why something was ear candy, why was something so engaging. So
how did you reverse engineer like a rock song?
You basically graph out, how much is sort of, separate the sections in terms of how many measures it was. So for instance, with music, it depends on the genre. And as things ebb and flow, sometimes it's popular to have, especially in sort of pop rock music, it's popular to have sort of an abbreviated first verse, and then you jump to a chorus, and then you go back to the next verse and it's maybe twice as long. And then you have twice as long of a chorus, and then maybe some sort of little break, some sort of a shift, a modulation that's pretty common. And then you might come back to yet another restating of the chorus, but it's been modulated. And so things like that, and so if there was something that interested me, I would break it down and look at it objectively like that. And I think it's very much the same thing that you're describing, at least by my understanding.
Yeah, absolutely. It is a way of discovering, through that kind of forensic examination. And it might sound, to some people who, haven't done much or any editing, that this is something that is totally, a world apart from where they are. But, what I'm describing is really not complicated. And with a little effort, this kind of forensic examination of sequence can reveal so much. One of the things that I guess, because I'm such an editing nut, I can't let it go. One of the things that in a way I get screenwriters to do is to edit. Short pieces. You don't have to be a great editor. Everyone's got a piece of editing software probably lying dormant, possibly on their laptop.
Sure.
It doesn't have great software. And you can download some clips and get to work on this thing straight away, or you can go out and shoot stuff on your mobile phone. My view is that you need to get into production. You need to be making things. With the end target of, through making stuff, you come to learn so much more about how the cut tells the story. Mm-hmm. One of the last chapter in the book is a how-to for how to create a sizzle reel. Mm-hmm. And again, I'm addressing people who possibly have never edited very much, but hopefully I'm showing ways to get into this thing, so that you can in relatively short time start put together images and sounds and text and music and so on to create moving stories. Right. And once you get into this thing, we live in a world now where we're pretty much, when I go into a room and I talk to any students from other courses and I ask them, how many of you guys edit? Like 90% of them do it. And of course they do, because editing is how we tell stories now. We tell stories in pictures and sounds. So most of us are already pretty editing literate. And I just think that developing that talent a little further can enormously enhance your screenwriting talent.
As we are about to land the plane here, I just have two last questions for you. And then remind me, I'm going to ask how we can get in touch with you, or what's the best place to find you online. And of course, we'll have the book links in the show notes. But who or what do you credit the most for helping to equip you for your success?
I think I haven't really spoken very much about him so far, but I suppose the biggest inspiration for the book has been Walter Murch. Mm-hmm. Walter Murch, who many of you will know, is the editor of seminal films like The Conversations, Apocalypse Now, sure. The English Patient, so forth. He is a brilliant editor, but I think many of us, certainly in the editing world, will know him also for his book. He wrote a book called In the Blink of an Eye, right. Which is a must read, for anyone who's interested in the craft. And he is the kind of co-partner of another book written by Michael Ondaatje called The Conversations. Mm-hmm. And Walter Murch very kindly, gave me a tremendous amount of advice. I would have Skype conversations with him while I was researching my book, and many of the ideas around writing for the cut have found their inspiration really in the writings of Walter Murch. So much of what he's like a kind of editor dreamer. He's like a sort of, he's someone who is an editor poet. He can really describe the craft in ways that no one else really comes close to. And so I guess I often hear his voice in the back of my mind when I'm writing. And he very kindly wrote a blurb for me.
Yes.
Which sits very proudly on the front of my book.
Yes, I that was one of the first things that struck me, because he is absolutely, I mean, to any of us who, I mean, this podcast is not exclusively for filmmaking folk, right, but I think there's a fair amount of overlap. And, I think that, he is someone who, if you're not in this business, he may be the most unsung hero that you don't already know, if this is not actually your industry. And so you're listening to this for conversation. And I believe he was the first person to be nominated or to win in 2 categories, also for sound editing, which is a completely different animal, as well as for picture editing. And that was for Apocalypse Now.
Yeah, he's a complete filmmaker. I mean, he also directed a feature film, Return to Oz. So he's a complete storyteller and a visionary, I think. And he wrote this beautiful blurb. Now, I will read it just because it so, I think, encapsulates really this idea of, writing in the world of words and how stories are told in moving images, and that, them existing in quite different worlds. He says, that this book will help filmmakers navigate the tricky path from the chrysalis of the screenplay to the butterfly of the film. That's beautiful. Isn't it?
That's beautiful. I was taking it in. Yeah, we said the same thing at the same time. That's beautiful. Last question, and you can take this as philosophically as you like. What's the best question that I didn't ask you? Whether about yourself or your work or what you think, where you think trends are going. But I'm more interested, if I knew you better, and I could ask perhaps even better questions. What's the best question about you that I didn't ask you? Like what animates you? What animates you to be a storyteller is one that I will fill in the blanks to help you out.
I suppose what animates me to tell stories, I'm not sure. It always seems something of a mystery to me. And I suppose it's a bit like that analogy that we made earlier on about music, that it will be a juxtaposition of images or sounds or a half-remembered dream or a conversation you overheard on the bus colliding in some way that suddenly animates you and mobilizes your storytelling faculty to make sense of those disconnected elements. I mean, to give you an idea, I am currently working on a screenplay called Rush the Sky. And the idea for it kind of crystallized in my mind one day when I was on a country walk and I was on my own, and these were beautiful rolling green hills, the South Downs in Sussex, and it was a beautiful blue sky, and it was just a fabulous walk through a dream is what it felt like. There was no one else around. It was warm. It was high summer, and I must have been feeling happy. And then this extraordinary thing happened that as I looked across to the nearest beautiful green hill, this huge, dark whale emerged over the top. It was a thunderhead. It was a storm. And it was as big as a continent, and it just rolled in from a clear blue sky. And within no time at all, I was in a huge electrical storm in the middle of nowhere. Yeah. And it was exhilarating. Oh, I love a storm, and then suddenly it was hailstones and I was in the chaos. And I thought, at that point, man, I can't think of many films that really celebrate the sky in that way. The ocean above our heads, and that was the I guess the kicking off point. For me, I used to go paragliding. And
Wow.
I used to hear of people getting sucked up into thunderheads and the kind of chaos that ensues after that. So this film is about a paraglider. He's a base jumper who ends up getting sucked into a thunderhead and comes down from being struck by lightning. He's in a coma, and it was the beginning of a story for me.
Wow, that's an awesome story. And I have a friend who's a bit of a maniac. Actually, he's based in London as well. He's an actor, and but he's a base jumper, and he does the wingsuits and everything, and it's just bananas. Yeah, he posts the videos I can't watch of him on free climbing, like the parkour free climbing some insane tower, and so I think that would be properly captured on film. That would be fantastic to watch. Greg, thank you so much for your time. Where can people find out more about you online or reach out if they so desire?
I have to say, I've been a bit slow off the blocks. My book's just come out, and I'm working on a website which is going to be called Writing for the Cut, so people will be able to find me fairly soon. But they'll find me on LinkedIn and on Facebook right now. But there's going to be a webpage coming up really soon.
Fantastic. Well, this will air in a few weeks from when we record, so no pressure, but you have a few weeks to get it together. or just send me whatever links. I'll post the links that you send to me in the show notes for now, and I'll update as time comes. But Greg, it's really great to talk to you. Thanks for your time.
Thanks, Brandon. Thanks so much. Take care.
All right, that's the show this week. Don't forget to visit my website, crazyinagoodway.com, to learn more about Greg or my other show guests. You can also find a contact form there and reach out and say hello or just offer some feedback or a nice comment if you would like. I appreciate you listening. Thanks again, and I'll see you next week.